To the town of our Frio rode a stranger one fine day. Hardly spoke to folks around him, didn't have too much to say. No one dared to ask his business, no one dared to make a slip. The stranger there among them had a big iron on his hip. Big iron on his hip.
Welcome to the next episode of Tales of Old Tombstone. Today we're talking from Prescott, Arizona and Tucson, Arizona with historian John Langelier. And with me today also is Bob Bosbell from Cave Creek, Arizona. Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Just having a great old time sitting here talking to my compadres. This is what I love to do.
Bob, we've got a guest on today, John Langelier from Tucson. I'd like you to introduce him. I believe the two of you have known each other for a long time.
Yes, John and I go way back, and some of the prisons we were in together are no longer in existence. But him and I have a great repartee over history. We argue about it all the time because we're so passionate about it. But no one is a better historian about the Buffalo Soldiers. And that's what we're going to talk to him about today. John, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here rather than outside in the rain in Tucson, which it's not coming at the right time of year, so I'm very confused.
John, is Tucson your hometown?
We came here when I was very young. I was about 5 years old, and so I consider it my hometown. I unfortunately was on Wise and left here in 1969, but the statute of limitations ran out, and so I was able to come back.
John, tell us a little bit about your latest book. Now, you have a series of books on the Buffalo Soldiers, isn't that correct?
Yeah, my first book actually was a co-production for the Chorale of the Westerners here in Tucson, and it was on one of the black chaplains, Chaplain Ellensworth, and I did that when I was stationed in Germany with a colleague of mine who was an Air Force major. When I came back, I started working on a series of books. Essentially, I consider them to be my high school version, my college undergraduate version, and the most recent book is somewhat my upper division version or graduate student version. So eventually I'll get it right, but I'm still working on it after, I started this in 1967. I may be slow, but I'm thorough.
And you did Buffalo Soldiers tour all over the country. Now, you've been doing that for how many years have you been doing that? It's been few.
Well, unfortunately, when one of my earlier books came out, some guy by the name of Bob Bosbell thought it would be cool to do a border-to-border Buffalo Soldier tour. And so I'll never speak to him again, and I certainly hope never to take him out for food, in a Mexican restaurant, because I know he hates it anyway. But yeah, I literally, because of your thought, Bob, I went all the way from here in Tucson, all the way up to the North Dakota, on the border in North Dakota, went to St. Louis, went to Alaska where the black troops were stationed during the Klondike, halcyon days of the Klondike. So I hit a couple of dozen other places with the first book. And frankly, it didn't promote sales that much, but it was a great deal of fun. And it got me, as we say in the military, boots on the ground in a lot of these places I had written about, but perhaps had never visited. So it was a great eye-opener, and it helped me when I did two subsequent books. The other one that I didn't mention was my favorite, and probably for a lot of reasons, and that was about young Lieutenant Powhatan Clark, a Medal of Honor recipient. And, of course, he was a 10th Cavalry officer, having been the worst in his class in terms of demerits and grades, even worse than George Custer. But unlike Custer, he survived many a firefight, received the Medal of Honor with the 10th Cavalry, and befriended and essentially helped kickstart some artist by the name of Frederick Remington, almost as famous as you.
Well, Don, you grew up in Tucson, and obviously in the 1950s and 1960s, the Western is king on television and still in the movie theaters. But you're not too far from Fort Lowell. You're not too far from a lot of the history that happened right there from the Spanish and Coronado and the historic indigenous tribes of southern Arizona, and of course the Wild West towns of Tombstone and Bisbee and Cochise County. When did you start getting really interested in the frontier history of the Arizona territory?
Well, you hit the nail on the head. Number one, I never grew up, but if I had, it would have been here in Tucson and southern Arizona. And you couldn't turn on the TV in the day, obviously, and not see something when I was younger from Rin Tin Tin and Fort Apache to later on to, Wyatt Earp and Wagon Train and everything in between that. And so I certainly was absolutely amazed when I came out here from a French-Canadian farming town to the west. This was, as our friend Little Big Man says, I wasn't, playing Indian. I was living Indian. Well, I was, got to the west and strapped on my cap pistols, and my mom and dad took me down to Tombstone, where the old Rose Tree Inn was. Ironically, the fellow who owned the inn at that time was a high school classmate of my mom from back in our town, all the way on the other side of the Mississippi River. So I thought it was great. And so I never saw Hugh O'Brien there. I kept looking for him, but he never came out with his bunt line. So, and of course, Fort Lowell in the day was still all, you couldn't get into it. It was all owned by the scouting, the Boy Scouts, and it had a large chain link fence around it. And it's just like, oh my God, I got to get in there. And finally it happened. And so I joined a living history group that was actually out of the University of Arizona as a cavalry mounted color guard. And so I got to play until eventually I had to go out and go to school myself and make a living. But that was an ugly part of my life, making a living, and I still haven't figured out how to do it well. But it was great coming here. And going to Nogales, of course, there's all the Hispanic history in Nogales and San Javier and Tubac missions. And so it was literally living in a three-dimensional textbook, but unlike textbooks, not boring at all.
Hey, John, tell us a little bit about some of the characters you've discovered. Jim Young comes to mind. You actually salvaged his headstone, gave him a headstone that he didn't have. Isn't that correct?
Well, you gave him the headstone. You know me, I never lift my wallet out of my pocket. But this was a fellow who had come out with John Slaughter's Texas Cowboys. And interestingly enough, a lot of those guys obviously were Southern sympathizers. Some had even fought in the war. But Jim was one of the first guys, and the only African-American I can find that actually had a mining claim in Tombstone. And he was, somewhat revered down there. The story goes that when Slaughter used to have his weekly poker game, he didn't want to be bothered, even though he was the sheriff and things, if you can just have mayhem until I'm through. And Jim would supposedly sit out in his chair out front of the door where Sheriff Slaughter was, and with his shotgun, and make sure that nobody stopped the game till the game was over. And so flash forward, Jim eventually moved up here to Tucson, married a Latina, had a family, but died destitute. And probably because he was married into a Hispanic family, at least was buried in the Catholic cemetery. But then we couldn't find him. We looked everywhere, finally found the records, and there was no marker. And so Bob stepped up and said, well, something's got to be done about that. So, gosh, it's been about 5 years ago. Bob, we went out and got the headstone put out, and several people, and just a small ceremony. So every January now I go out and have a talk with our friend and make sure he's comfortable where he is and tell him to save a space for me eventually.
I'm more proud of that than I think almost anything that we've accomplished in the 25 years of being with True West Magazine. So thank you, sir, for making that happen.
Well, you made it happen. I'm good at spending other people's money. Remember, I was with the government for years, remember?
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about Tombstone and the community and the black baseball, etc.
Well, the baseball part didn't really happen, and it'll be in my next book about the baseball, and I won't give too much of information because I know that Stuart will run out and publish it before I do and make it a masterpiece, and I won't get a nickel from residuals. But Tombstone, interestingly enough, some of the first, of course, Tombstone is extremely important, not only because of the lore of the Earps and the Clantons and all that, and the mining, but of course, it's kind of a fire base for troops to come through during the Apache campaigns, where they can, particularly starting in the 1880s, replenish their supplies, because they just don't have somebody medevacing people in or bringing in supplies to them on the trail. They're all on horseback and with their mule trains or what have you. And so some of the earliest references are in the 1880s, early 1880s, when Nana during the Victorial period, and Nana's my hero because he was probably about 5 foot and about 80 or 90 years old. No one knows for sure. Was just cutting a swath of pillaging and burning throughout New Mexico and Arizona. And finally, a large contingent, kind of like a John Ford movie, closed in on him on the Dragoon Mountains in the South Pass. And the lead element came out of New Mexico, were 9th Cavalrymen. And of course, after the firefight, they were pretty much out of everything, and so the commanding officer in charge sent in for Tombstone and supplies to replenish everything. Well, fast forward about 5 years, and this Lieutenant Clark that I had mentioned was on the border in Nogales originally, and had a major firefight with his guys. They lost one of the corporals, and one was severely wounded and had to have his leg amputated, and eventually got a medical discharge soon thereafter. And it was a guy who essentially was interviewed by Remington, and Remington's first big commission, front page of one of the major illustrated national newspapers of the time, ran that firefight. And they came back through Tombstone after the fight, because that was one of the easiest ways to swing through while they were trying to get back. Ultimately, they were trying to get this wounded corporal to Fort Huachuca. So coming up from Mexico, you pass through Tombstone. And originally, there was glowing, hyperbolic kind of, typical Victorian description of this into the Tombstone newspaper, until the Tombstone newspaper was a Southern kind of leaning organization. And in the day, that was meant you were a Democrat, and Democrats did not see eye to eye with Republicans, and the fact that they had created these black units after the Civil War, etc. So about 4 days later, they just lambasted how much this campaign had done actually nothing. So all this heroics that they reported one day, the next day was old news, and so they turned it around on its head. But and actually, in another time in the newspaper, they were one of the first mentions here in Arizona of the term Buffalo Soldier, and said unlike some of the people today who claim it was honorific, said that the Apaches do not fear these guys, and they do not respect them. They can't fight. Well, that wasn't true, but that is one of many incidences where this whole idea of the Native American bestowed upon the black soldier this title because they honored him and respected him is I'm afraid more lore than reality. It's the old when the legend becomes fact, print the legend type of thing. So Tombstone was also a place for people to come through from the fort, particularly Fort Huachuca. As you both know, it's not that far from Tombstone. Today it's a hop, skip, and a jump. Obviously, in the day it was 20 plus miles, so it was a lot harder to get to. But it was a place that soldiers could go on what we would say as R&R today. And even a hunting party, for instance, one of the first mentions up in the newspaper, the Arizona Republican, mentioned that a hunting party came out of the fort and came into town after they had killed 18, white-tailed deer and several other things. And that wasn't just for sport. you get tired of beans and hardtack, so they were helping bring some fresh, different kind of meat back to the soldiers. And by 1915, when the black soldiers who had left here in the 1890s had returned because of the Mexican Revolution, the bands were very, very popular. And I have a Benson Signal article from 1915 that headlines "A Jolly Party and a Jolly Time Saturday Night." So all these folks piled into cars, which, as you know, in 1915 are pretty rare. And they headed down from Benson, etc., and they ended up, going to Tombstone for a band concert by the 9th Cavalry Band out of Huachuca. The post commander would periodically go down there, and Chaplain Scott, who was one of the black chaplains, would go down there. Their visits, however, were a lot more quiet than the average soldier. The average soldier went down, especially after payday, to blow off steam and get rid of his boredom, and that, as you can imagine, could lead into problems. There were fights, there were incarcerations from drunk and disorderly and that sort of thing. Eventually, that subsided because they built their own hog ranch and den of iniquity outside the fort. Eventually, one of them called White City, and all that kind of mayhem transferred to right outside the post. Yet, because Tombstone was the county seat, many of the capital crimes, the major crimes, would be tried in Tombstone. And I won't go into detail, but there were a lot of high-profile types of murders and assaults, and particularly that took place, including one woman who had killed a soldier down in the area, and who was tried and sentenced to death, which was a rather unusual situation. So the Tombstone newspaper is loaded, the old Epitaph is loaded with amazing information about these things, and like the movie title, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Well, John, we are going to take a break here, and when we come back, I'd like us to discuss a little bit further and give our listeners an idea of the distances and locations. As you just mentioned, Tombstone is the county seat of Cochise County, and we have the Army stationed in a variety of places within riding distance of Tombstone. And let's give our listeners a little bit of description of the different forts and camps within, within the area. And if you were coming there for a day off or for a trial, how long it would take you to get there, and the day-to-day life of Buffalo soldiers in southern Arizona in the late 19th century. And we'll be back after we thank some of our sponsors.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Stuart. And thank you, John, for your story. We're looking forward to part 2 and the rest of the story of the Buffalo Soldiers. We come to you from the town that is an unusual place. As someone has said, there are a lot of towns around, but there's probably no town quite like Tombstone. And in fact, there are people who actually believe that in the history of the West, that what happened in Tombstone was very much a turning point in a number of ways, in the way the West even developed. So it not only became the town too tough to die, the lore and legend of the people who were there, that carried on, both in some very positive ways and obviously in perhaps not so positive ways. It truly is an expression of life itself. Well, not only is Tombstone a unique town, it has one of the more unique guest ranch experiences. That's right, the Tombstone Monument Ranch. There are a lot of wonderful dude ranches or guest ranches, but this is an unusual one. Very different, and you will experience the difference. I just talked to Michelle, who is the manager of this fine establishment. She's, a Tombstone person, and she knows all the stories and the lore and the legend. In fact, she'll say with a smile, well, I've lived a good part of some of those stories. And there are, as she says, we've got a lot of characters around the Tombstone Monument Ranch, and we have some very unique experiences. No, it's not a resort where you just sit in the sun and, swim in the pool. This is a place where you can have a real transforming experience for you and your family. You can actually be a cowboy, not just play cowboys at the Tombstone Monument Ranch. So, Michelle is waiting to hear from you, so go to tombstonemonumentranch.com. That's tombstonemonumentranch.com, and see if you can find a place for you there, and they'll be more than happy to find a special experience just for you.
Well, we're back with John Langelier, our special guest today on Tales of Old Tombstone, and with Bob Bosbell, who is one of the great and noted historians of Tombstone, Arizona, the Earps, and Billy the Kid, and Doc Holliday. And we're talking today with John about the Buffalo Soldiers in Cochise County, and the fact that most of us don't think about Tombstone as the county seat. Today it's Bisbee, but I don't think most of us realize how far it takes us to go from where the forts were, how long it would take to ride in, but the importance of getting out of camp as a soldier, as a trooper in the late 19th century in southern Arizona, and what would bring them to Tombstone. And John, why don't you give us a little description about the forts and what it would have been like for a Buffalo Soldier to come into Tombstone in the 1880s and 1890s?
Well, of course, pre-Civil War, in the antebellum period, the forts are few and far between. And, of course, those essentially all closed down during the time of the war. But post-war, they begin to return to the territory, the federal troops. And by that time, they had established the bastion up there that became Fort Whipple up in Prescott, the first territorial capital. And eventually Fort Lowell moved from downtown Tucson to its present site to the east of town, from the center of what was the working part of the town with all the stage stops, and eventually the railroad came in. And of course, the railroad makes a huge difference for supplying these folks and in general making life a lot simpler. Our colleague or our kind of heroine who was there, Martha Summerhays, describes what it was like in the 70s pre-railroad, and in the 80s when the railroad had come in, and it was a totally different world. You could even have oysters on the half shell. Well, most black soldiers aren't having oysters on the half shell, but they are living in the various forts, mostly at least in this part of the world, Fort Huachuca, so that's the closest to Tombstone. They're, of course, up at Fort Grant, Fort Apache, and Fort Thomas, which was kind of considered to be one of those less than desirable duty stations, and at San Carlos on the reservation, you're kind of rotating there. So Tombstone is the closest you're going to get, about 20 some odd miles to Fort Huachuca and back and forth. And so you would, if you got into a wagon, because again, there's no railroad running between that community and the fort at any given time. And so it'd be a wagon ride, and it'd be, the wagon ride of 20 plus miles, depending on how fast the mules are going along. That could take a half a day to get down there. And, that might not be so bad, but if you're hungover, coming back a couple of days later, not quite as pleasant. The troops made $13 a month, and after they peeled off from the top to pay the laundresses who did their clothing, and for various and sundry other reasons why they had to pay out, they still had some spending money for their nickel beer and what have you in that area. And it was, again, a respite from the everyday living in a communal barracks with 40, 50, 60 other guys who may not be bathing at the time. Most of these guys are single. They could not afford to have families, number one, on their meager pay. $13 doesn't sound like much, but you have to do a multiplier effect by what that meant today. But they had 3 squares a day, depending on, where they were, how good they were, varied. And they had a roof over their head and clothing, etc. So they had medical care as such as it was. And as a consequence, it was a fairly good life, but they had a little more expendable dollars. Yeah, an average cowpuncher coming into Tombstone would have more money maybe after a cattle drive, but he could be flat bust a couple of days later. And of course, the forts were kind of like fire bases. They weren't really, the forts that we see in the Hollywood movies with the stockades and stuff, ready to repel the attack of the Native Americans of whatever area, the Comanches or whatever they were supposed to be in the film. But they're like small communities with a hospital and all those things going, for them. But they're pretty boring. So getting to Tombstone was a great way to break the monotony and get out and let off a little bit of steam, so to speak. The troops also spent a certain amount of time in the field, which was quite not only grueling on them, but they lost a lot of horses. The type of horses that the Army brought in were beautiful horses with pedigrees, so to speak, thoroughbred and such, but they weren't made for the rugged terrain of Arizona and the heat and all the variations that we have. And so these guys, when they took to the field, would become, pretty miserable, as so with their animals in many respects. And in certain times when they were down here in Santa Cruz County and over, of course, in Cochise County, they'd become infantry because they'd lose enough horses. Some of these guys had no horses. They'd either have to walk or ride double. And to try and ride double and chase down, or go on foot and chase down, say, an Apache party, not going to happen. Just the Apaches know the area. They'll ride a horse till it dies and go steal another one and keep going on until they get into Mexico. So some of these places become temporary camps. Camp Bonita in the Chiricahuas is a classic example. It's now part of the National Park Service, but at one time companies would rotate in and out of that place. So it became kind of a mini fort. It was a tent fort, basically a field operation, although there was a little civilian house that rented by the commanding officer, whose daughter, his name was Cooper, and his daughter became a novelist and wrote a novel for kids about the days of Geronimo. But it was based very closely on her real experiences as an Army brat, a teenager coming out to the West and living literally with her mom and dad in the field with their black cook, and being chaperoned. All these black soldiers were like kind of the surrogate, godfathers to her while they were out in the field, something totally different. And she ultimately married the son of the famous Hooker Ranch. And so officers' lives obviously were a lot different. They had more pay. They lived in a officers' quarters, which sometimes could be quite nice, especially depending on rank. Whereas going back to the enlisted men, they had no families unless they were able to get one of the rare positions as a ordnance sergeant, or one of the specialties where the small quarters went also with a hike in pay, or were fortunate enough to have a spouse who was a laundress, because essentially Army regulations only allowed for 2 women officially on a military post, and that was laundresses and a hospital matron. And so everybody else kind of in their idea of thinking, or their frame of thinking, was a camp follower. But you wouldn't probably want to tell the post commander's wife she was a camp follower. Sure, wouldn't exactly get you a lot of favor from that individual, much less his spouse. So, at any rate,
what about Bowie? What about Fort Bowie? Where does that fit into the Buffalo Soldiers and life there? Camp Bonita would be kind of southeast of Bowie, and then Huachuca, of course, is southwest. Did any Buffalo Soldiers ever station at or ride through Bowie on their patrols?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, going back to Lieutenant Clark, he took some great photographs when his guys were coming in out of the field. It's kind of once again one of those fire-based stations where if you're not getting back into, say, Tombstone or Tucson or wherever to get replenished, you're getting replenished at whatever the closest fort is, and you got to pay the guys. He's not carrying around their pay, so you go in, you get the paymaster to come pay your troops who've been out in the field and missed pay from Fort Grant or wherever they were theoretically stationed on a regular basis. And so they did get to Bowie a couple of times, but in the early 1890s, the black troops were not stationed there in terms of the cavalry, but people sometimes forget that there were not only the 9th and 10th Cavalry regiments, but by 1869, there were 2 black regiments of infantry, the 24th and the 25th. And the 24th had a contingent station at Fort Bowie at a time that things were getting better there. As we all know, Bowie essentially goes back to the early part of the Civil War and is and one of those areas that, again, with the Apache Pass and all the things that are going on in that area, and the Butterfield stagecoach becomes a very important overland route, respite and protective area for the pass and stuff. So the 24th is there at the same time that the Army decided, well, we've had all these Indian scouts. Why don't we have Indian soldiers? And so they had an experiment of having one company each in several of the infantry and cavalry regiments that were Native Americans. In the case here, they would have Apaches. In the case up north, they might have Cheyenne, depending on, or Navajo if they were, up in the Four Corners area. And they tried that experiment for a while. So there's some incredible photographs that are from the time that Clark was at the fort. And they showed the black soldiers, the Native Americans, and of course, the officers are all white at this time. There's only, a few black officers in the period, and basically it's Charles Young by now because Henry O. Flipper, the first African-American graduate of West Point, had been cashiered and dismissed from the Army. And so it's literally red, white, and black. It's a cross section. And there's Clark is enamored because there's a Chinese gentleman there at the fort, and this guy is evidently just fascinating as heck. So it's a very interesting community at Bowie at this time, and again, it periodically serves as a place for the troops to come through, and then that short-lived period, because shortly after the 24th reports to that area, that's when they closed down Fort Bowie and most of the forts, with the idea that the Apache wars are finally over. Geronimo and his followers are all back in Florida and ultimately get transferred over a duration of time, as we know, to Oklahoma. And so that fort does have a short period of time. And there are times when the black soldiers, infantry, and cavalry are stationed together. At San Carlos is a classic example. And
so
what's also...
Let me just interrupt you real quick, John. How are the black troops treated when they go to town in Bisbee or Tombstone, or how?
That's probably the most important operative question. Racism is rampant in places like Texas after the Civil War, and I'll give you one example. A white officer disappears almost immediately after the Civil War during Reconstruction in Texas, and they finally find his body months later, and he's been done in by the Klan. Doesn't matter what color your skin are, you're a Yankee. Well, double that if you're a black Yankee, because that's essentially how you're being perceived. And there are a lot of racial incidents in Texas before, in the early period when they're there, and of course afterwards with Brownsville and the Houston 1917 Houston so-called riot and such. But Arizona, with very few exceptions, tend to be, your money is green. We don't care what your other complexion is. And Booker T. Washington right after statehood is visiting Phoenix, and he kind of sits down the demographics. Arizona is a patchwork quilt. It's not full of a bunch of white people. It's got white people. It has Latinos. It has blacks. It has a lot of Native Americans. And so it's more of a mosaic than most places. And so tolerance tends to be a little bit better. There are certainly racial incidences. There was an outbreak before the 4th of July with the 10th Cavalry coming in. They were supposed to participate in a parade in Bisbee, and some white MP, equivalent of a white MP, harassed one of the guys, and it triggered an event, but no one was killed. Matter of fact, the only people shot were the soldiers and this and a white police officer who probably helped instigate this thing. So there was racism here, but not as bad as one would think. In fact, going back to Frederick Remington learns about the heroics of this Lieutenant Clark and picking up this Corporal Scott and putting him over his shoulder and carrying him out in the middle of a firefight where he himself could have been killed from the first sergeant, the black first sergeant. And he's in the Palace Hotel here in town buying the black first sergeant a brandy, not whiskey, brandy, and having a discussion and learning about this young officer who becomes kind of Remington's hero and muse. So, they come into these various towns. They're accepted. If they get into trouble, like any other soldier, black or white, they get into trouble. Prescott's newspaper one time mentioned when the 14th Infantry, an all-white unit, left and were replaced by the 10th Cavalry, both the band and Troop B, that this was the quietest time ever that they had seen with troops. They called the 14th Infantry the Bloody 14th. And these guys came into town. They were respectful. And matter of fact, a lot of them didn't even drink. They were temperance people. And they were more interested in buying clothing in the local mercantiles and kind of duding up, as they said, the dude outfits, because they had been stationed in Texas for so long, they probably hadn't seen any decent clothing for God knows how long. And so there were incidents, they were very few and far between. And by the teens, when the troops are strung all the way out from El Paso to Yuma and beyond because of the Mexican Revolution, these soldiers began to intermarry into the Hispanic community. And of course, Arizona comes up with anti-marriage laws that do not allow whites to marry anybody but whites, or whites to be married by anybody but whites. And they consider under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that Hispanics are also white, conveniently, but of course they're probably treated with more racial prejudice than a lot of other groups. So, but blacks could marry Indians, blacks could marry Asians, or blacks could marry other blacks, according to these laws that were on the books well into the post World War II period. And some of them got around, and you'll find descendants today that are both from descendants of black soldiers down in Nogales and elsewhere, and they even have an annual event of the descendants of the Buffalo Soldiers in Nogales, and not a few of them were intermarried into the black community. So it was a better place to be. It was no perfect place to be as an individual, because you're still discriminated against, and I keep referring to the black soldiers versus the white. These are segregated regiments. The officers are white, with the exception of the 3 black graduates of West Point in the 19th century who are a minority within a minority. And then you have also the white regiments, who are oftentimes comprised of upwards 20 or 30% of European immigrants. And incidentally, these black soldiers, unlike the immigrants and some of the other whites who, things are bad on the outside, so you join the army for 5 years and maybe you make it and maybe you desert. The desertion in the black regiments traditionally was the lowest in the U.S. Army year after year after year, and the reenlistment rates tended to be higher because the black soldier looked on this as a profession of arms, not just a job of work.
Well, John, we have just learned more than I even expected today, and I'm looking forward to you coming back to us and talking more about Buffalo Soldiers across the West. But we're going to take a break. We're going to come back, and Bob has a question that we're going to discuss from one of our listeners about Tombstone, and we will be back after we thank one of our sponsors, and we look forward to you sending us your questions about Old Tombstone.
And thank you, Bob, Stuart, and John. Fascinating stories of the Buffalo Soldiers. We appreciate your time and your talent. Wow, what a story. Hey, I bet you have a story to tell. Almost everybody does. They just don't know it. What I love to do, after some 40-plus years of broadcast experience around the world, I want to help ordinary, extraordinary people like you Beyond the Radio. My name is Stan Houston, and I have a long career as a business performance coach and as an international broadcaster. And what I want to do is encourage you to be on the radio. That's right, be on the radio. You can have your own radio station, or you can have your own radio program, or you perhaps could be a sponsor of a program like this and maybe even voice it yourself for your business, for your good cause, for something that's important to you. We are here to do any of those things for you. So perhaps you'd like to do a sponsorship commercial for Tales of Old Tombstone. Perhaps you'd like to have your own program. Perhaps you might even like to have your own station and have a number of programs. Well, we call it the What It Takes Radio Company, and that's what we do. We do what it takes to help people like you share their wisdom, insight, and truth, tell their story, share their good cause and their ideas, and get it on the worldwide radio. So reach out to me at stan@witradio.net. That's Stan at WIT Radio, witradio.net. Or you can go to our web stage, witradio.net. There's a little video to explain it to you. And in fact, there's even a free online course that'll help you go from being a beginner to perhaps a world-class broadcaster. Let's see if we can make that happen. Let's leap forward in 24. And now, back to the program.
Welcome back to Tales of Old Tombstone with Stuart Rosebrook and Bob Bosbell. And our special guest this week is John Langelier, a historian of the American West. And we've been talking about Buffalo Soldiers. But in our segment 3 of each episode, we like to introduce a question from a listener. The question goes out to Bob Bell. Bob, tell us what we're going to be talking about today. What is the question?
Well, this one is actually in the family, in the house, as it were, because Jana Bommersback and myself, we did a book 2 years ago called Hellraisers and Trailblazers, The Real Women of the Wild West. And we were pretty excited. I think Jana actually found this character. Cathay Williams was born a slave in Missouri in 1842. And according to the story as we presented it, she passed herself off as a man and was a Buffalo Soldier, and therefore is the only female Buffalo Soldier in history. And imagine my surprise when I sat down with John Langelier. And what did you tell me, sir?
Well, myself and Dr. Leo Oliva, who's a real historian, both went down the same path. As with many other folks who question this, how could you pass any physicals, etc.? It was the other way around. This was a man passing himself off as a woman. He identified as a female gender. He was transgender, but not during his time in the military. He joined in at Jefferson Barracks area, which is in, of course, today's St. Louis. And he enlisted, went to Kansas, and marched all the way from Kansas to New Mexico, ultimately at Fort Cummings, which is not too far from the 10 across from the Arizona border. It's gone now, but it's ruins. And one of those almost unique forts that actually had 4 walls around it, like the Hollywood versions. But he lied about everything. He was not a Buffalo Soldier woman. He was a malingerer, a goldbrick, as people would say in the military today. He decided he didn't want to be in, and he claimed he was dismissed because they found out he was a woman. No, his dismissal papers say because he had been spent more time in hospital, he was considered to be unfit for duty, and he was also considered, this is in writing in his discharge, feeble-minded. And as a result, he leaves the Army, and he adopts the garb of a woman. We think maybe even works for one of the officers in another post in New Mexico. Ultimately will find his way to Colorado, the Trinidad area, etc., where in 1876 a newspaper reporter comes out from St. Louis and interviews then Cathay Williams, or Kathy Williams as he was now calling himself. And he's spun all this tale about, served with Sherman and was the cook for, Grant and all these people, which has probably never happened. Claimed to be born in Missouri as a slave but flash forward 10 years later, the 1870 census, and claims that born with his parents in New Mexico. And also and then another times is born in Colorado in another census. So the individual reinvents themselves, as many of us do. But the newspaper guy, he hook, line, and sinker, and everybody based it upon one newspaper article that the guy never followed up on it, believed everything he was told. Another thing he was told is Kathy Williams' husband had stolen her mules and wagon and abandoned her. This is in 1876. In 1880, it appears in the census, her husband is there. I guess he must have thought better of it and came back. I don't know. I mean, so why everybody says this? Well, this person disappears in about 1892, 93. Must have died, must have been in an unmarked grave, all those wonderful things. Not true. Not true. At that time, he goes before the courts. Yeah, because he's considered to be unfit and needs to essentially be institutionalized. Is institutionalized. They bring him to the institution where the women are being kept, and the ladies come up and report to the superintendent of the institution. She's not a she. She's a he. They have a hearing and send him to the institution where all the men are in Colorado, and at that time he remains a male in garb until his death in the early 20th century, and is buried in an unmarked grave, regrettably. So maybe need another headstone, Bob, in Colorado.
So other than that, though, the story's true.
Other than that, remember my statement from before. There are markers in New Mexico, in Colorado, in Kansas, to the person that never existed. There's no Kathy Williams. There's a William Cathay. There are no female Buffalo Soldiers that we know of. Now, it doesn't mean there wasn't, but it'd be pretty hard to consider in an open bay barracks after 3 to 5 years with men all around you to conceal your gender. So this never happened. But it's hard to drive a stake in the heart of this vampire. People don't want to hear it. They do. Again, they rather have the legend than the facts sometimes. So, but that's why I put it in the new book, and that's why Leo Oliva's new article that came out in the Santa Fe Trails Journal. And there's one other individual who I won't embarrass him by saying he came to the same conclusion to the degree he even wanted to exhume the body, but I guess the folks who have the cemetery aren't into that, and I understand.
Yeah.
So that is a Wild West tale, I tell you what.
And to give you an idea, there was just recently on Netflix they completely veneered over. They called the character Amos Jackson, and it was a woman portraying this individual. Said that she had been a Buffalo Soldier and had served through the Civil War and all this sort of thing. And not only that, but was the fastest gun since God knows who, could speak Comanche and fire a bow and arrow better than Robin Hood. So it was a great TV show, but I had to drink a lot to watch it.
Yeah. That was true. So anyway.
So thank you for throwing me that one under the bus, Bob. Now they'll all come after me.
Yeah, no, it's great, man. It's always fun to talk to you, John. You're just a joy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. We look forward to having you back on another episode of Tales of Old Tombstone. And if you have a question for Bob Bosbell about Tombstone, Arizona, and the Old West, please send your email to tulane66kids@gmail.com. That's tulane66kids@gmail.com. We look forward to having you on our show next week and listening to our next guest. And that's it for this week on Tales of Old Tombstone.
Big iron on his head, Big iron, when he tried to match the ranger with the big iron on his hip. Big iron on his hip.